This is part 4 of my walkthrough for Krein on the upcoming quest, Legends of Iotunheim. Here I'm actually going to do a side quest because we need it in order to unlock the final chapter. There are basically two different ways of unlocking the final chapter. So the first way is what we're doing now, which is straightforward. The second way involves doing a number of side quests to get a dragon named Vazenstein to help you at the very end. So I don't know if I mentioned it, but I don't think I did actually. Usually side quests in most games of the Elder Scrolls are precisely that, most especially in Skyrim. And generally this is true about games at large, I think. Side quests are just small things on the side of the main path that are just there for side entertainment, often for filler and stuff like that. There are a handful of games where that's different. Cyberpunk 2077, for example, has some side quests that actually have more relevance than they seem and end up contributing to something in the main quest or a larger quest and change the direction of it. The same is true in Krein. The choices the player makes in a number of the side quests have an effect on what happens in the main story. The choices you make in side quests that can be accessed early on have impact on what happens much later on in the campaign. Dialogue also affects things, which is usually not the case in Skyrim. Certain dialogue choices will change the course of the future for the story in Krein. It will unlock certain content or hide certain content, so on and so forth. In fact, there are actually like 4 or 5 different endings in the main story. 3 of them are totally different from each other. And, you know, the ending results in, based on a number of things the player does throughout the whole mod, pretty much.
Didn't like it. Just odd jobs now. Whatever pays.
Well, take care of yourself. You were the best damn blacksmith I knew, even as an Argonian.
I'll do that.
What do you want? Need something? This mine's not like Dust Moon back in the valley. The ice is quite fragile. Watch your step. Wisps. Know how they got here. They won't appear at that time at least. We missed something. Maybe the cold's getting to my head. You're free to stay down here as you'd like.
So here is a puzzle of sorts. We'll count it. There's a magical stone at the bottom that glows when you strike it. But there's also a journal down there that describes what happens to the stone, and it hints that you have to hit it with a certain thing in order to have something happen. A dragon has to hit it is more precisely what it says, or something to that effect. Well, you don't have a dragon, but you do have a dragonbone mace, or possibly you're lucky and you already have a dragonbone weapon. Then the seal will dissolve and done.
I don't know where that roguish Argonian wants us to go, but I'm sure it won't be an easy venture. Well, I'd like your help with something. I don't have much to offer, but there is another magical item I'm looking for. Maybe you're right. If you change your mind, let me know.
Right.
Well now, you actually showed up. You've got more heart than I expected, girl.
Ugh, your condescension is becoming trite. I hope you know that. You never mentioned anything about going into the temple.
The temple?
This Nordic ruin. That's what the locals around here call it. I'm sure nobody remembers its true name.
I'm just following the map he gave me. I don't know anything about a temple.
I was told it was sealed for a good reason. It took a legion of soldiers to do it. An untamed spirit ruled underneath, harvesting the souls of the villagers.
Folks and their tall tales. It's just another dusty old wreck.
How do you...
Then there's also an easy pillar puzzle coming up where we just have to infer the fourth pillar, as the other three are already marked. So it seems that a little bit of pattern recognition leads us to match an unmarked pillar with the same setting of its neighboring one.
This should be the way forward, I think. See if you can find a way to unlock this door.
We'll go one at a time. In case something happens. You first, mage.
After that, we finally go into Iotunheim, which ends up being a bit of a surprise in that we start off with the typical Nordic architecture. And as we make our way through, past the bridge and into the entrance, the architecture immediately shifts to an original one, an unseen one. Once more, I can't really say the architecture here in Iotunheim reflects a particular historical one. There are some hallway parts that I take issue with in that they're just unrefined details. But that's an aside, being nitpicky. There's been an attempt to capture a sense of a dungeon or ruin in a dark, gritty atmosphere with fire and ice as a motif. Overall, does it successfully? It gets there, but I do think a non-linear multi-layer approach, which is probably the hardest design layout, would probably have been more interesting. The topography, the layout of the level is interesting because it's especially linear, but bilinear, if you will, because the player has two doors to choose from that have different places to go in. And each is a puzzle as well. Each side has a puzzle. I'm not sure which one I did in this walkthrough, but I ended up doing both anyway. The more mysterious puzzle is the one where the forge is, and there you have a soul gem that shoots a firebolt at a mirror, or a magical mirror that reflects it onto a latch, which triggers a secret staircase. But the problem is that the soul gem caster is too far away from the staircase. So naturally you deduce that using a firebolt on your own right next to the staircase is the way to go, in order to get up to the staircase fast enough. Alternatively, there's a unique switch puzzle on the other side where pulling a lever rotates 2 switches. One of them rotates 1 step, another rotates 2 steps, and each has a glowing dragon on a particular step. There I think you could figure out that setting them up to their respective glowing steps would make something happen. So when they're both pointing at the glowing dragon. So the first one you'd have to move to the switch to the step right before it, so that, you know, because it moved 1 step, the next, once you pull the lever, it'll go to the next one. And the second one, you'll move 2 steps before it. So then, after you activate the lever, they'll both point to the same thing. So, somewhat easier puzzle than the other option, I guess. That leads you to a big room full of piles of gold and a number of artifacts, such as a crystal ball called the Heart of Iotunheim, and a dead dragon stuffed in the piles of gold, which is clearly a reference to The Hobbit, although the Lord of the Rings trilogy is obviously the better series. Now, the environment, I think, doesn't stand out as much as the gameplay, which gives you a consistent intensity throughout, which is a nice contrast to what we've seen before. And a decent demonstration that you don't necessarily have to have original gameplay to make things interesting in delivering a DLC for Skyrim. Again, that's playing it on a vanilla setup, so maybe it's less intense if you have, I don't know, extra stuff from other mods. You have to go to the firebolt puzzle anyway for the side quest that's important, so there's that. And I mentioned linear and non-linear level design very briefly, so let me explain what I mean before I forget. Most levels in general are linear single layer. Now, these aren't concrete definitions, but the closest I can do off the top of my head to make something like that a concrete idea would be to think of topology to some extent. If you flatten a level to 2 dimensions as though you were looking at it from above, and then topologically you're able to morph the level into a sphere, which means all the extremities reduce to one source and have no loops, then that's linear. And single layer means that there aren't multiple levels above or below that constitute their own utility. Meaning, it can't just be a single room you get from a flight of stairs, and that's it. It has to be more than that. It has to add significant characteristics to the level on its own. There's also something I characterize, which is integration. If a level is integrated or not, which maybe is more intermediate description of it. Which I'll mention in a second, but let me explain further. So, linear single layer levels are the easiest to make. I've found that looking across level design, when you begin to vary from that, it becomes more difficult to make things look aesthetic and well designed, and especially more difficult when you begin to vary both. There's also symmetry versus asymmetry, but I guess that can be an intermediate definition as well. It's not fundamental per se. Well, I guess it is actually, but it's self-evident, so I won't go. Now, it's not too difficult, it's not rocket science, but it gets tricky. I found that old school FPS level designers, boomer shooters, you know, those from Unreal Tournament to Quake 3 to Half-Life, the most skilled ones at least, were very capable of making multi-level, non-linear integrated levels. And this is based on me just looking at level design, really being observant of it. A lot of, I think most gamers just pass through it and take a gander, and maybe it's a cool looking level and they'll look at it for a few seconds and then go on. But interested in level design and environment design. I've like Elder Scrolls Online, for example, I think is an atrocious game, but the level design is generally gorgeous. And the only reason I buy another DLC is just to go through the level design. That's all I do. I don't care about the rest of the game at all. I think the PvP is good, but it gets dry. It gets dry after a while. Although they've added, I think, the battleground stuff, which is a little bit more fun. But anyway, point being, I'm very observant of level design, I think, more than most gamers. So, in Elder Scrolls Online, for example, linear single layer, again, you don't see anything varying from that generally. And let's think about a modern game like Apex Legends, modern FPS, Battle Royale. Yeah, again, linear single layer, and it's more difficult in their case because it's a huge open space. Nothing can be really integrated, so there's like individual buildings and stuff, or clusters of buildings, and they're very sanitized, very simplistic. There's a reason for that. Fine, it's about with Apex Legends, it's mostly about the gameplay. People, I think, don't really care overall how the level is set up. Although the most recent season has a level that's somewhat, I would say, almost meets the criteria for integrated. It's definitely, there's multi-layer, multi-level, but it's still relatively linear. Anyway, point being, it's relatively rare based on my categorization of it. So, for whatever reason, based on my own survey, it seems that the most talented level designers of that style of like boomer shooter levels coalesced around Unreal Engine 1 through Unreal Engine 3. Back in the day, the level design community in Unreal Tournament was huge, and there were some incredible designs, but you don't have to even go back digging through custom maps to figure out like what I'm talking about. A lot of the deathmatch maps in Unreal Tournament 99 or Unreal Tournament 2004, and even some in Unreal Tournament 3, had that kind of build style, and they pulled it off very well. Of course, you can only do so much coming from that towards a set-piece level building such as Creation Engine. But there are a handful of levels in vanilla Skyrim that pull that off pretty well, that are multi-level, integrated, non-linear. One of them, which I forgot the name of, but you'll find it pretty easily, you'll maybe even know what I'm talking about, is the one that is in the Dawnguard DLC. That's the big spread out cave. That is a good example of something that's in Skyrim, vanilla DLC, that's non-linear, has multiple levels integrated, meaning that multiple parts that kind of could be their own level are connected to each other in a seamless way. That's basically what I'm talking about when I mean integrated. Non-integrated it's kind of just a room connected to another room, and it feels very artificially connected, which is not good if you're making a cave, for example. You don't want that. So, if you go through these levels, just notice how there are multiple layers that integrate with each other in an interesting way. That's actually not easy to do without some additional planning, especially in non-organic environments, such as the exteriors or interiors of buildings, doing this from scratch. Well, in virtually every case in Skyrim, cave environments are the most common for non-linear multi-layer, but even then it's not very common, because it's easier to do it with organic shapes, such as caves. It makes more sense. It feels more natural to do it. It's more difficult to do it artificially and keep everything looking good and interesting and aesthetic and etc. and original. All these things have to come into consideration. So as far as mods go, I can't even think of a level that's non-linear multi-layer integrated, except for, I don't remember for sure, so I might be wrong, but maybe there's one in Enderal that I remember,
What was that?
but I'm not sure. And Krein has a handful. I think this is mainly due to the fact that fantasy worlds follow a medieval kind of environment building for artificial environments, such as castles, cathedrals, towns, and so on. And conventionally, all of those are single layer, linear, because that's how it is in real life, because it turns out it's difficult to design in general that something that varies from that. But also, if you're an architect and you're actually building non-linear, multi-layer buildings, then you're probably a psycho, because those kinds of designs are pretty much for gameplay, not for apartments or malls and so on.
Is your friend trying to get us killed?
I wouldn't exactly call him a friend, but now that you mention it, maybe he is.
And you're okay with that?
No, but we're not exactly on good terms. I figured something like this might happen.
Who exactly is this person again?
He knows how to get the second book. That's good enough for me.
That doesn't answer my question.
You and your questions. He's a master of dark magic. Very useful skill set for what we're dealing with. Any more exploding Draugr behind this next door? How about you do the honors, Dragonborn?
Now, we're getting to the Flame Keeper, the next boss. And this boss is a bit more involved because it has a number of mechanics. Firstly, he's going to spawn ads in the left, center, and right of the platform. These are critical because unlike the boss fights in other cases, you need to keep killing the ads until there's one that's a Cold Flame Atronach that spawns, which you have to kill them because specifically they give you the spell that you need in order to attack the boss. And you have to cast the spell 3 or 4 times to beat them. The Atronachs might sometimes fall off the platform on their own because they just do, okay? Because why do they like to do that? I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and pretend to know what goes on in the mind of an Atronach. Anyway, the biggest obstacle here is the Flame Vortex. So the Flame Vortex, he spawns every so often. That basically one-shots you. You'll be lucky to get away from that if you're anywhere near it. So you have to avoid that altogether. And he'll basically spawn it from the furthest end of the platform relative to your location. There's also the fire charge that gets shot to random parts of the platform every so often from the center, which is mostly negligible, but if you're low on health, it will get you. And with all these boss fights, there's basically trial and error until you come up with strategy to execute. And so my strategy here was to use force push shout to easily push them off the ads off the platform, so I don't have to exert too much energy trying to kill them. Keep a healing spell handy and have a useful array of potions. Fire resistance potions, not critical, but very, very useful. Now, the Cold Flame Atronachs have a stronger spell, so they're more dangerous and they have to be taken out faster regardless, whereas the others can be ignored if you're far away from them. I would say this is a mid-tier, maybe upper mid-tier in difficulty, so we're definitely climbing the ladder in difficulty because this one is more challenging than the previous ones. There's also, he will cast a volley of fire bolts that do area of effect damage as well, so you need to be careful with that. Constantly paying attention to what the boss does, because sometimes he will cast something and you're in a certain position where you're screwed if you don't react in time. Finally, we come upon another puzzle, which is this solution is basically to use intuition to realize that the color of the magical stream should match the color of the runes, and you pretty much just have to identify the direction of it. Pretty easy overall if you manage to figure out what's going on in the first place. Whereas if it's not intuitive, then you might be in a struggle a bit more. Overall, relatively straightforward though.